Hi there, my name is Jamil Dabir, and in this video, I'm going to be recording some lessons learned from a course called Introduction to Linux LFS101X, which is offered through edX. So this is just a quick overview of the major lessons I learned. So first up, virtual machines are very useful. Second of all, it's good to understand the Linux file system because it's different from Windows. It's good to understand Linux file extensions because, again, they're kind of different from how Windows does things. Next, I'm going to talk about why it's important that you know what your package manager in your particular Linux distribution is. I'm going to talk about a couple of must-have keyboard shortcuts. Then I'm going to talk about good places to look for help if you're having trouble with Bash or with Linux. And the last thing I want to discuss is just leveraging any past experience you might have with MS-DOS or Unix. Okay, so what are virtual machines? Virtual machines, how you would want to imagine it is you're going to run a program and it's going to open up a window in Windows and you're going to have another operating system running inside of that window, I should say. So I have a few recommendations for setting up virtual machines. First is to use VMware. It's very popular, it's powerful, it's super easy to use, and it's free. The next few points all have to do with your computer hardware. You're probably going to want to have a multi-core CPU. Basically, what the virtual machine does is it splits up your computer's resources. So if you have a 4-core CPU, you could have 2 of them on your virtual machine, and you could have 2 cores still running Windows in the background. Again, you're going to want lots of RAM because you're going to basically partition or allocate some RAM to your virtual machine, and you're going to allocate some RAM for your native operating system. Hard drive space is really important. Operating systems tend to take up quite a bit of hard drive space. Plus, you're basically allocating a certain amount of hard drive space for the virtual machine. So if you say allocate 30 gigs of memory to the virtual machine, that's all you're going to have when you boot up the virtual machine. That's all that's in there. And the last one is definitely a bonus. If you can have more than one monitor, it's super helpful because you just imagine you have Windows running on one monitor and then you have your virtual machine running Linux on another monitor. So in a way, it would almost seem like there's nothing special going on. You just have 2 monitors, each is running a separate operating system. So makes things easy if you want to switch between the 2 of them. It's very handy. Okay, I'll just go through a few quick alternatives to virtual machines. I've ran most of these in the past, and in my opinion, I found them inferior to virtual machines for learning. So first up is just installing Linux as your main OS. It's pretty risky. If it's your first time using Linux, there's lots of things that are different with Linux. It's tougher to use. You may have interruptions to your ordinary life. If you're someone who writes a lot of Word documents, Microsoft Word isn't going to run natively on Linux. You'd have to set up an emulator. It's a whole bunch of extra work. So just taking the dive, going head first and installing Linux raw on your machine probably isn't the best idea. Next up, multi-boot system. You could imagine something like as your computer's booting up, you're going to pick, am I going to start Windows or am I going to start Linux? And then you're going to boot into that operating system. I haven't heard the best things about this method. And again, you're kind of losing the advantage of virtual machines where you can still hop back into Windows if you have a problem with Linux. So not my favorite solution. The third up is a hard drive switcher. There's actually a picture of one here. It's the image, the rightmost image. Basically what the hard drive switcher is, it's a bunch of buttons. And if you push the button, it's going to select a hard drive, and then you boot your computer up, it's going to boot to that hard drive. So you'd essentially be running a separate operating system on each hard drive. This requires extra hardware, plus requires extra hard drives, and you're basically still losing that option of just switching between windows super easily with a couple of mouse clicks. You got to stand up, push a button, reboot your computer, and then you can get into Windows. But I've used a hard drive switcher in the past. It's a pretty solid option. Final option is just to buy a Raspberry Pi or like a small single board computer. They cost between 50 and $100 typically. There's advantages to it. Again, it's not easy to duck out and go back into Windows. You're going to have to restart your computer, potentially switch around a few cables if you're sharing a monitor between multiple computers. So I still see virtual machines as the best out of all of these options, but these other options do exist. Another great idea is to try and understand the Linux file system. What you'll notice is things are quite a bit different from Windows. So one big difference is Windows typically has a C drive. If you've gone all the way to the top of the file structure in Windows, your path is basically just going to be C://. And that's different in Linux. It's actually just called a root directory in Linux. So there's no C drive or anything like that. Once you're in the root directory in Linux, you'll see a few folders that have really important information. So bin is a big one. Bin contains binary files. And you can find almost all the commands that you use in bash are actually located in the bin folder. Dev has files for your devices. Etc or etc has your system configuration, and there's a ton of other really important directories, but these will just give you a feel for what you're dealing with and just to feel comfortable, because you'll see it's quite a bit different from Windows, where you would see program files and things like that, which is what Windows has. So Windows does file extensions a little different. From what I've read, there's less emphasis on file extensions, and Linux has a whole bunch of file extensions that look odd to me. As someone who used a lot of Windows, I call these weird, but there's nothing weird about them at all. So I have a list here: GZ, BZ2, XZ, and tar. These all basically do the same thing. They're an archive of compressed files. So you're putting a whole bunch of files together and you're compressing them. Similar to WinZip or WinRAR on Windows, except Linux kind of has its own compression systems. Tar in particular, I remember thinking was a really weird one, but it just stands for tape archive. So it's got a long history from back in the day when tapes were more popular for storage. One thing you'll probably notice is that Linux does not use .exe files. That's more of a Windows thing. So to add new functionality or new programs to Linux, you're typically going to go through your file manager. You're going to download things through there, and then you'll be given a shortcut or a way to actually run your program. Knowing your package manager is super important in Linux, especially if you're going to do any work in bash. I've listed out a few common ones here. So in Ubuntu, your package manager is apt. So you'd run sudo apt install and then the package name. Red Hat has yum or RPM. Again, similar, you substitute out the word apt with yum or whichever one you're going to use. And OpenSUSE uses zypper and yast. So again, you're just substituting out that one word and putting in the appropriate package manager for your Linux distribution. Knowing a couple keyboard shortcuts are an absolute must-have in Linux. I've gotten stuck with Linux many times in the past, and just knowing the following, like Control-C, can close a program that's running in bash. So a common example is you run the command top in bash, and what top does is it shows all of your processes that are running in your computer, and it's listing them by whichever process is taking up the most resources. So you can get stuck on the top screen. It doesn't actually tell you how to really leave it, and it basically just keeps running. So it kind of takes over your system. So you have to hit Control-C, and then you'll close out top, and then you can go back to doing things in bash. But I can remember in the past trying things like this, and I'd have to restart my computer because it's like I don't know how to get out of the program. So another one of these fairly common keyboard shortcuts is just to push Q, and then it might open another option or something, and that you would just push Q to quit a program while it's running in bash. Getting help is pretty important with Linux. It was for me anyways. There's a good free textbook that was recommended in the Intro to Linux course I took called The Linux Command Line by William Schatz. It's completely free. Just Google it. You should be able to find it. Nice big thick textbook. It's got lots of content in it. The man pages are another, that's basically the Linux manual. So when you're in Bash, you can actually just type man space, put in your command, and it'll give detailed instructions on how to use that command. Another option, kind of similar to man, is the help option. So I've got an example here. So like mkdir, so that makes a directory. So you do mkdir space dash dash help, and that's going to bring up a help screen for make directory if you're having trouble using it. Leverage past experience with MS-DOS or Unix. I'm quite familiar with MS-DOS. I grew up on that. And what I would say is some of the commands are quite similar. So in MS-DOS, you do cd dot dot, and that'll take you up one level in the file structure. In Linux, you use cd space dot dot, and it basically does the same thing. CD is like a change directory. So if you do cd space and then the directory's name, that will change the directory in Linux, and that works exactly the same as it does in DOS. dir lists out a list of directories. One of my favorites when I was younger was dir/w. That doesn't work with Linux, unfortunately, but dir does still work. So the last comment, I can't speak to too much, but I would assume that anyone who has Unix experience would probably feel fairly comfortable with Linux. Linux is designed to be a Unix-like OS, so I'm sure there would be some transferable skills from Unix to Linux, but I don't know firsthand. Here's my conclusions. Linux is quite a bit different from Windows. The transition from Windows to Linux isn't the easiest thing in the world. It's good to ask a lot of questions. It's good to dig deep. I mentioned in an earlier video, I felt kind of unsure of myself with Linux a lot of the time. And for me, what's made me feel better is just studying Linux and getting a deeper understanding of it. I don't find Linux to be the most intuitive operating system. I've used like Android on my phone, and the cool thing with Android is like I just pick up my phone and I know how to use it. The day I started, I've used Apple devices, and same thing, you just pick up and go. Linux isn't exactly like that. It's a little bit more involved. Takes a little bit more effort to learn. The GUI is pretty good. The graphical user interface. Bash takes some studying, and even the GUI, it's not exactly the same as the other ones. And I should be saying, just for clarity, Android is actually a version of Linux. So I guess me saying Android's easier to use than Linux is a bit of a silly statement, but the meaning's still there. When I'm referring to Linux, I'm talking about Ubuntu or OpenSUSE or CentOS in this case. And I highly recommend setting up a safe environment to learn. Don't put everything on your transition to Linux if you're interested in learning this. Like, virtual machines are really good. It's a really nice, safe way to learn Linux. If you're having problems, you can just switch over to Windows, and that's something I found so nice. If you crash your Linux, you can go Google search on Windows and find out why you crashed Windows, or why things didn't work the way you expected them to. So that's a conclusion for this presentation. I'm planning to start studying some software testing. I'm looking at the ISTQB certification, so I'm sure I'll be doing another video on that in a couple of weeks. Thank you.